I'm going to start by looking at the historical and or educational inadequacies with regards to what we call quality and relevance of the curriculum. I'm going to talk about this reflecting on my grandmother's farming activity that I witnessed as a small boy. And from there, I'm going to try and pull out my education disharmony or my lack of empowerment in terms of education for sustainable development, or in terms of what I want to refer to as climate empowerment. I'll also look at global and regional responses in terms of enabling policies for education transformation. I will also show some evidence of how teacher education is lagged behind regardless of global and regional responses to things like climate change, climate education, ESD initiated transformative issues in the curriculum. Then lastly, I will look at some of the work that we are doing in the sustainability tasks with teachers to try and cover that gap. My grandmother, ever smiling, she was ever busy in her field. As a small boy, before going to school, I remember now and again going to stay with her. And I remember very well she would give me some tasks to do with my friends. One of the tasks that I remember vividly is we used to play. Playing is a task, by the way. So she would tell us, go and play over there. It was a position that is adjacent or in between the mountains and her field. She strategically chose that place for us to play because she knew very well that in our play we'll also be chasing monkeys and baboons away from a field. So that's a task. One thing that I have discovered and that I learned over the years, and something that I came to realize long after she was gone, was her plot had several crops in it. In fact, she was practicing what we now call mixed cropping. She never used those terms. To me, I don't think she was educated. So in a plot, you could see a variety of crops, pumpkins, maize, groundnuts, and she did not cut the big trees, as you can see in the background. In our village, we would get people who were employed by government, whom we call land development officers. In Shona, we used to call them mudumenis. These were educated people, in quotation marks. They would come now and again to the village, preach the monocropping agriculture, teach people what they used to call modern ways of farming. But what is my grandmother resisted all this. She didn't like anything to do with monocropping. She didn't like anything to do with the so-called modern ways of farming. One day I remember very well how she stood up. This LDO went down, passed through my grandmother's plot, preached to her how badly she was farming and she should change, separate pumpkins from maize, from groundnuts and so forth. She simply looked at him, she didn't respond, then off he went to the village. On his way up, back from the village and maybe back to his office, he looked so hungry and he said it, I'm hungry, Granny, what have you cooked? You know, in Africa, you if you get to a homestead or to a place where there are people who demand food. My grandmother responded in a very defiant voice, I'm sorry, you cannot eat what I have prepared because I have mixed the mealies and pumpkins in the same pot. He was surprised and expressed how grateful he was because he grew up eating the same dish. Then my grandmother said, no, you are not eating what I have prepared. Because on your way down, you were shouting at me for mixing these crops in our fields. Yet, you know very well that the food is great when they're coming from the same pot. This was a defiant exercise shown by my grandmother. Eventually, of course, she gave him the food and she told him not to pass through his plot again. When they parted ways, they laughed. I was surprised. How did this old woman, uneducated according to me, is defying what learned people are saying? It was a homework in my mind. Then I started going to school, high, and I met additional dilemmas in my education. At home, I saw that there was very little reference to that modern agriculture, especially with my grandmother. She did not embrace the teachings of the LDO. This was her teaching to me. Leave the LDO alone. You think he's educated. I don't think what they're preaching is enough. But her education was not as convincing. The story was not as convincing because, to me, knowledge was supposed to be coming from learned people. But I was also surprised when I went to school that there was very little reference, if any at all, to the traditional methods of farming. We introduced to agriculture in school, but what we had was monocropping. If it is a patch of maize, it was only maize. Then we did not at all, we end up as doing, visiting fertilizer companies, doing the chemistry of nitrogenous fertilizers, and so forth and so forth. Excuse me. But what surprised me most was each time we had a very bad season, maybe low rainfall or a shorter rainfall season, and these were becoming more and more, most crops that were under the so-called modern agriculture could quickly wilt. And I remember very well my grandmother producing her food in a very bad season, although at a smaller scale than other years, but at least she had something to eat. That was not the end of my surprise. I also noticed that villagers did not at all embrace the traditional ways of farming. They quickly took upon themselves, went with LDO, and practiced monocrop. So, with time, we witnessed more and more climate change issues like frequent droughts, cyclones, floods, reduction in agricultural yields, and so forth. In other words, the whole livelihood support system of rural communities was impacted negatively, very, very, very severely. Then we saw some attempts to respond, the permaculture and the organic farming coming in. This is when I started to meet the Mutizwas, the Pesanais, the Mandikunzas. Then they were preaching this gospel of green initiatives, permaculture, and so forth. But to my surprise, this method, the principles, were based on the same traditional farming that my grandmother practiced. Pesana, some of you have read his work. He worked a lot on seed sovereignty. And I think my grandmother had that sovereignty when it comes to seeds and agricultural input. She never, at one moment, depended on government in terms of her inputs. She had all her things in order before the farming season. Then we had global responses like the SDGs, you all know them, the Africa we want. These were now enabling policies that were coming to try and look at issues that people were looking at, be it issues like hunger, conflicts, health issues, and sometimes directly issues that were directly related to climate change, like droughts, less and less food. The SDGs were meant to sort of lead governments and policymakers and policy actors to come up with a framework of thinking in terms of how best can they tackle the world's issues, global level and at a local level. The Africa we went to, the Agenda 2063, has some policy frameworks that were taken upon by most governments. And in the curriculum, we started to see most countries, especially in Southern Africa, transforming their basic education curriculum. Most of them, if I can cite Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, most of them and many more were driven by the SDG and the Vision 2030 thinking. We started to see things like inclusivity, lifelong learning, equity and fairness, gender sensitivity, some of the things that were not there when I went to school myself: tolerance, environmental justice, accountability, diversity and culture of non-violence, transparency. All these came into the curriculum. So most governments pumped a lot of resources in transforming their basic education curricula. In the TVET sector, we also noticed things like green skills and all the related policies. Again, policies, coming up with policies is one thing, and transforming practice is another thing. So what was very noticeable, especially with the work that we're doing now in SST, Sustainability Starts with Teachers, is teacher education is struggling to demonstrate its effectiveness in delivering the quality of teaching and learning that addresses the 21st century challenges, including climate change. In other words, teacher educators are less empowered in terms of climate change curriculum or climate change informed curriculum. The competence of teacher education to confront current and global and local challenges is questionable because it's struggling to reorient the existing education system. We had, for example, in Zim in Zambia, it came out of the workshop that we are doing in the country, we had a situation whereby the basic education has transformed, but teachers who are coming out of teacher education are struggling to keep up with the pace. I think the Global Monitoring Report that was done in 2016 summed it all, because they recommended that teacher education needs to be more adequately aligned with the SDGs, and teachers need to be supported to understand and implement education for sustainable development. This is where we came in as SST. After all this realization, so SST, which is CEDA funded, came to being as a capacity building program for teacher and TVET education on ESD. And as a methodology, we have adopted the transformative learning that seeks to empower teachers and teacher educators in curriculum practices. SST, by its design, thrives to empower and thrives on empowering transformative methodology, which we normally called. So basically, in brief, this is the objectives of the Sustainability Teachers. It's running in 11 countries in SADC regions, as I said, and they anticipated the results in each and every country that sustainability principles are integrated into education and the training environments, with emphasis on curriculum change in teacher education institutions and tech work. The second one is ESD capacity of teacher and TVET institutions is enhanced via an SST Advanced ESD regional program. Then the third one is ESD is reinforce the national education and sustainable development policies in the region, with emphasis on policies influencing the education of teachers and TVET educators for Goal 4 of the SDGs Target 4.7. And strengthening a professional network in the region on ESD. Now, let me talk about the change project, because remember I've given you the gap, my curriculum dilemma, my school dilemma myself. We hope, and we're seeing it happening now with the examples that we've done, the countries that we've worked with, that the change project methodology will provide answers to the following questions. How can teacher education and TVET education be transformed in order to respond to Africa's sustainable development concerns and to 21st century challenges, including climate change? How should teacher education and TVET education instruction be restructured to enable this? Point 3, using transformative learning methods and creating transformative learning. Learning is transformative if it follows transformative learning pedagogies. Students learn for life when they are actively involved, receive feedback, are incentivized, feel supported, see relevance of the content. I think this one is very important to me. They see relevance. I mean, we've had a situation whereby I didn't see relevance during my junior years in school, because the science that I was learning, the chemistry of nitrogenous fertilizer that I was learning in school, my grandmother did not like that at all. So at home, there was no relevance of this education. It was good for me. Of course, I memorized the periodic table. I managed to balance equations, but so forth. But the moment we close school and go home, there was no that connection. So we're trying to say, in these transformative learning pedagogies, learners should see relevance. And relevance in most cases comes when the learning tries to address issues in the community. Then you have information that is clear and consistent, challenged to think critically. If you look at all the new curriculum frameworks in all the countries in Southern Africa, this word, critical thinking, comes in every curriculum framework. Now we're asking ourselves, is teacher education now, the way it is, molding the next set of teachers to be critical thinkers? And lastly, make connections to prayer, practice, and knowledge. If in my agriculture lessons at school, if they taught me monoculture, but also making reference to mixed cropping that my grandmother was practicing, I think I was going to see this some connection and to debate and to come up as a critical thinker and see which one is better than the other, what are the advantages and disadvantages, and so forth. Again, talking about transformative learning, I took this one from a well-known professor in the region, Professor Rob O'Donoghue. He also adapted it from an English lady called Anne Edwards, who talks about a subject discipline pedagogy. This is also driving our change project thinking in terms of curriculum transformation. Starting with the school subject discipline, this is the startup. Then we go to, if you want your students to be involved in terms of being participating, you can do a simple photo narrative, say, for example, of waste in your community. Photo narrative, using their own smartphones. Then we go to questions, finding out, why do we have so much plastics in our vicinity? Where are they coming from? Why do people dump them, and so forth? Then we go to empathy and concern. What should we do? Compassion and purpose, try out and challenge. I want to refer to the so-called competence-based curricula in Southern Africa. They all refer to what they call learning tasks for children, for learners, where they should come up with very small projects to develop hands-on critical thinking, inquiry, discussion, tolerance, empathy, collaboration in our young minds. But you do find that most teachers leave teacher education without the necessary skills to lead or to guide learners to come up with this. So this is one framework which can be used easily by a teacher if he or she gets the information in the teacher education system. Again, these are some of it's just an elaboration of what we've seen earlier on. Think, starting with the touch, we can start from anywhere. Field work encounters, what do we have in our vicinity? Take action, plan together, dialogue, think about it, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. The previous one, it's only that this one is now specifically drawing on from the heritage, from what we value. I really valued what my grandmother used to do because we used to get food from her farming practices. And as a young boy, I observed that on a bad year, some people can lose their entire crop, but my grandmother will have something to harvest. But that was not reinforced in school. So my heritage was denied by local schooling. So for example, climate change competencies were not reinforced in the formal schooling. So what we're trying to do now is we have so many practices in the region that that were done before and that can enrich learning and reinforce the 21st century required competencies. Then, the success story. We've got so many change projects in the region after exposing them to teacher educators to these frameworks. Then now they go back to their institutions, come up with starting small initiative, transformative initiative in their institutions. And we've seen that most of them have been really welcomed by the community of the institution. For example, we have very success stories, change projects that are working on curriculum harmonization, that is aligning teacher and TVET education with the competence-based education in schools. As I said earlier on, this we discovered in Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The three countries came up with what they call competence-based education. And in its production, in its formulation, the competence-based education in basic education did not involve as much as required the teacher education aspect of it. So teacher educators were detached. After coming to the course, SST course, they're now transforming their own teacher education institutions to align that with school curriculum. We also have seen whole institution ESD change projects. For example, Marymount and Mthatha, they are reorienting every aspect of the college life to bring sustainability in it. It started with one lady who came for training. She built a community of practice. The entry point was litter in the campus. People just throwing litter anyhow. So they came together and started discussing using the framework that I've shown you before. Then each and every department came up with a transformation contribution to ESD. For example, agriculture, they started reusing some of the waste material into making compost and so forth. Early childhood development trainee teachers and with their lecturers, they started picking some of the plastic, reusable plastic to make toys for the young ones and to come up with teaching support materials from the West, and language departments. They wrote dramas, came up with dramas, songs, poems to reinforce the transformation that was happening in the college. The academic, the support staff, the BESA, the finance people, including the principal of the institution, also realized the good work that was getting the college. So they came up with sustainability measures in using water, energy, electricity, and at the end, they even, in their budget for the institution, ESD was allocated some funds for the activity that they were doing. They went on to involve the city council, the local authority, the municipality, to help them in some of the activities. And the municipality also opened its hands to new ideas and came up with some work plans which had embraced sustainability practices. We also have change projects that are working on improving the quality and relevance of education by harnessing indigenous ways of knowing and formal education. So there are quite a number of them who are looking at how best can we use indigenous ways of knowing to improve the teaching of, say, science. How best, some of them are working on to close the gap in terms of content of material. For example, in Zim, they simply said every language should be taught in schools, no matter how small it is in terms of population. So you find that all of a sudden they were in need of books. So in this change project, some of the institutions in the country are coming up with, teaming up with students who are on teaching practice to start to write books, especially for early childhood learning, to try and close the gap. Then some other change projects are focusing on building ESD capacity of fellow teacher educators and teachers. You find that sometimes you find even a geography teacher who says, yeah, climate change is new, I don't know how even to teach it. They cannot make connections between climate issues with social issues like, for example, inequality, gender violence, gender-based violence, and so forth and so forth. So the beauty of ESD, it embraces all these issues that we are facing and transform them, or use the energy to transform into pedagogics, content, and so forth. Broadening assessment, including summative assessment and formative assessment, as well as assessment of significant learning. You find that the new competence-based curriculum in every country that I've seen it has moved from summative assessment only to also embrace formative assessment. As I said earlier on, teachers are now required to guide students or their learners to do very small projects in their communities. But most teachers were not trained to supervise such little projects being done by, say, grade 8. So again, the assessment framework that we're working with, which is called the assessment of significant learning, you'll see it on our website, will try and help both teacher educators and teachers as well as curriculum planners in broadening the scope of assessment. Then lastly, another example that we're having of change projects is somebody who is using some participants, examples in Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe, who are using the biosphere reserves as learning hubs. You do find that teachers struggle to make use of the resources that are in their vicinity to enrich learning. So the use of biosphere reserve, not necessarily only biospheres, any field work that can be done in a given environment outside can enrich learning. So we have change projects that are doing that. So if you can visit all these change project examples on our website. Thank you very much.